My name is Roy Meyer, and it's my privilege to be the facilitator for this evening's discussion on lead contamination in homes and water. Let me give you a little bit of my background, and then I'll let my other speakers, when they come up to speak, introduce themselves as well. I spent over 35 years in the environmental field, mostly in pesticides with the DEP. Prior to that, I spent 7 years in academics. And for the past 14 years, I've been an adjunct professor at Rutgers School of Public Health. So I'm going to give you a little background on excuse me, lead and lead exposure. Back in the day, and some of us are old enough to remember that day, nobody worried about lead in water because we had way too much lead around us. Paint, dust, soil, food, it was all around us. Two of the biggest sources were leaded gasoline and lead paint, particularly indoor paint. From the earliest time, lead was introduced into gasoline to make it run better. The engines ran better with a little lead in there. Most of that lead went out the tailpipe. Most of it went up into the air, and so we had lead all over the place. Lead paint still is an issue, particularly in areas where you do what most of us do. We don't strip anything down. We just put another coat of paint over it. We put latex paint over it. That comes off, and what's underneath is probably a lead-based paint. And notoriously, in inner city settings particularly, there were efforts made to eliminate children picking up the flakes and eating them. Not too successful in a lot of ways because they're there and that's what kids do. Lead is very persistent. Lead's a base element. It doesn't break down, doesn't go to anything else, and it bioaccumulates in your body. So you can tell in a lot of cases what kind of exposures people had based on the amount of bioaccumulated lead they have in their system. Now, EPA estimates that drinking water can make up about 20% or more of a person's total exposure to lead. Infants who consume mostly mixed formula can receive 40 to 60% of their exposure from drinking water because you're mixing that formula with the drinking water source that potentially could be contaminated.
You skipped ahead.
I skipped ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, that's two.
Okay, thank you. In terms of lead exposure, as part of the Safe Drinking Water Act, EPA has set the maximum contaminant level goal for drinking water at 0. And that's because it's a harmful, toxic metal. It can be harmful to human health at very low levels. There's no real safe level of lead. So it's not like, oh, I have to wait until it gets to a certain point before it starts being a problem. Lead doesn't go away, lead bioaccumulates. So you're going to be taking on a bigger and bigger burden of lead. The CDC recommends that public health actions be initiated when the level of lead in a child's blood is 5 micrograms per deciliter. I don't expect you to do the math, but that's a very small amount. Most of the lead that goes into the human body sequesters in the bones. Only about 2% goes into the blood. So it's an indicator of how much exposure and how much of a body burden that individual is carrying. Lead is toxic, as I said. It's irreversible damage. It's not like if you remove the exposure, things are going to be okay. Most of these exposures, by the way, tend to be long-term chronic exposures. You know, again, it's not like you're working in a foundry and something terrible happens and you get hit with a massive dose. That kind of acute exposure doesn't present the same kind of problem as opposed to being exposed on a daily basis to very low levels. It's a constant, it's more and more as you go along. It can have serious effects on a child's health. Noteworthy is damage to the brain and the nervous system, slowed growth and development, learning and behavior problems, and hearing and speech problems. There's no acute signs, there's no manifestation of a physical nature. Most of it is tied to the central nervous system. So you're going to have impacts that are imperceptible, but the child simply has these kind of central nervous system problems. The nervous system doesn't respond and grow properly. You don't have the kind of development you might expect from a child at a given age. For adults, we're not any better off. It's an increased risk of high blood pressure because the loading in the blood of lead causes problems, which ends up being manifested in high blood pressure. Lead can affect the liver, the kidneys, your ability to make hemoglobin, as well as affecting your central nervous system. And particularly kidney damage. A lot of people who have worked in the lead industry for years, smelters, and still in Europe today, in Eastern Europe, there are smelters that are operating that people are exposed. They have tremendous problems with kidneys because they've been exposed in their workplace. They go home and there's no scrubbers, there's no elimination of that exposure, so they have the chronic exposure at home. How does lead get into drinking water? In most cases, it enters when surface pipes that contain lead corrode, especially when the water is high acidity or low mineral content that corrodes the pipes and the fixtures. The most common problem is with brass or chrome-plated brass faucets and fixtures with lead solder, which is what you're going to find in most situations in a town like Red Bank. Significant amounts of lead can enter into the water, especially hot water. Cliff's shaking his head. He's not going to.
It was in between.
You're in between,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. A lot of the homes in Red Bank are actually so old that lead solder wasn't even developed yet. So, you know, I mean,
Okay.
And that's why it was, yeah.
So, and I friendly correction.
Yeah.
Now shut and stop interrupting.
You shook my hand.
Homes built that were before 1986 would be more likely to have lead pipes, fixtures, and most importantly, the solder. Corrosion is a dissolving or a wearing away of the metal caused by a chemical reaction between the water and the plumbing. The factors involved include the chemistry of the water, the acidity and alkalinity, the types and amounts of minerals in the water. All of that comes into play in terms of are you more or less likely to have the corrosion occurring. The amount of lead that it comes in contact with, the temperature of the water, the amount of wear on the pipes, how long the water sits in the pipes, and the presence of protective scales or coatings inside the plumbing materials. That's a relatively recent development, the coatings,
Well,
in the last 20 years?
there's been the scaling of the pipes. You want me to talk about?
Yeah, go ahead,
Okay,
please.
so there's a hardness test, or a corrosivity test, excuse me, called the Langolier Index, that water professionals use to determine whether their pipes have water that is either building up a protective scale or too acidic. So when you say it's within the last 20 years, people have realized, I think 1992, the EPA came down with the lead, real strict lead requirements, and people started to realize that the best way to not allow lead to come out of the pipe was to scale the inside of the pipe.
Okay.
So what water systems did, good water systems did, was they started to increase the pH of the water. And when you increase the pH of the water, the way that this Langolier index works is it goes from this water that is acidic that is sort of corrosive to a scaling, non-corrosive system. So the pipes in Red Bank, and we'll get into that in a little bit, do have a protective scale, and when we do work in the pipes, we see it. But more than that, all the indexes are showing that it is the case with the water chemistry.
Okay.
So we'll get to all that, I'm
Thank you.
sure. Yeah. So.
Thank you.
Mhm.
A lot of the interest of dealing with lead and water was generated because of Flint, Michigan. And I sincerely doubt that the perfect storm that existed in Flint and in the state of Michigan's government is going to exist elsewhere, but it's worth noting how it all came about. In order to reduce the shortfall, the city announced that a new pipeline will be built to deliver water from Lake Huron into Flint. It's where Flint had always gotten their water. Lake Huron was notorious for being good quality water. It fed the city of Detroit, among other places. Flint is effectively a suburb of Detroit. While it was under construction, the city went to the Flint River. After the switch, residents said the water started to look, smell, and taste funny. The Flint River, unlike Lake Huron, is not a good source of water. Tests in 2015 indicated elevated levels of lead in the water in residents' houses. There's a class action lawsuit charged that the state wasn't treating the water with the anti-corrosive agents, as Prickliff outlined a moment ago, in violation of federal law. As a result, the water was eroding the iron water mains, turning the water brown. About half of the service lines were made of lead. As the water wasn't properly treated, lead began leaching into the water supply system. And effectively, despite the input of the municipality and EPA and folks who were doing research, the local government as well as the state government pretty much ignored the situation. And it took lawsuits to get things changed and at least modified. Sure, Amy's going to talk about exposure reduction. I'm just going to touch on a few points. Flush the water. One of the easiest things to do. The water's been sitting in the pipes for more than 6 hours. Let it run for a little while. 15, 30 seconds, a minute, not a big deal. Especially if you're using it for drinking, cooking, or preparing beverages. Don't consume water from the hot water tap. Hot water taps are much more likely to have lead associated with the elevated temperature of the water than the cold water tap. Don't boil water excessively because the materials, the minerals that are in there may coexist with the lead. They may not be a problem at the time it comes out of the tap, but when you boil it, you're concentrating it down. Water filtration systems. And people ask this a lot. It was the easiest thing to kind of look up on the internet. And Amy, again, I'm presuming you're going to have a little more input on this. But the 3 ways to go are reverse osmosis, distillation, and carbon filters, especially designed to remove lead. In my opinion, reverse osmosis really is the only one that I can say works. The others kind of work. So you have a situation where if your home has elevated lead levels, no, a Brita filter is not going to take it out. Brita filter will do nothing other than make you feel better about your filtering your water. What you really need to do is consider what kind of water you have, examine your personal situation. Is there a carbon filter system that would work for your circumstances, or do you install a reverse osmosis system in your home? And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my co-conspirators. Cliff, Amy, did you arm wrestle to see who goes next?
Sure, I can. Do you know how to set that up? And
I'll get that up for you in a moment.
I'll pull out a couple of things here. So while you're doing that. So I'm Amy Goldsmith. I'm the New Jersey State Director of Clean Water Action. And not to be confused with another organization that's really marvelous, but it's not us, Clean Ocean Action. Clean Water Action was founded in 1972. Our founder, David Zwick, wrote the Clean Water Act, hence our name, Clean Water Action. We've been in New Jersey since 1982. So maybe somebody's knocked on your door sometime and talked to you about our issues, asked you to sign a support statement, write a letter, make a contribution. That's the kind of organization we are. We're a grassroots organization. We work on drinking water, but a whole range of other issues, environmental justice. We work on the ports issues. We work on energy. So a wide range of issues, mental squalor. So I'm gonna, if you don't mind flipping, I'm gonna not cover the things all that was already covered. But if you want sort of a little bit more of a visual of sources of lead in drinking water, this actually shows you have the service line, which is the line from the curb to your house. That's the responsibility of the property owner. The main line, which is from the curb out to the street, that's the responsibility of the city, traditionally, is how it's set up. Not all towns are set up the same way. And then you have all these fixtures, you have the solder, the fixtures themselves, and the pipes themselves. It really depends on your particular system. Just so you know that one of the other things that Clean Water Action was very involved in has been the original passage of the Safe Drinking Water Act and then the subsequent amendments to the Safe Drinking Water Act in the 90s. Those changes happened actually because of the Toms River wells. You might remember a very large spike in childhood cancers as a result of contaminated wells due to a toxic waste site that was nearby that leached into the wells. At that time, Congressman Saxton, a Republican, good environmentalist, he worked with us to make changes to the Safe Drinking Water Act. And so now there are things that you get in the mail that you might need to be talking about later, but you get something like this. This is the Red Bank version. This is from 2016. It's your water quality report or your consumer confidence report. Every year, utilities and water suppliers are supposed to provide this information to you. We work very hard to make it so that you can actually read it and understand it. Also, there's a requirement to do source water protections. And so the sources of drinking water that are sampled is at the source. So here in Red Bank, you have wells, deep wells that are used half the year. And then we get water from New Jersey American the other half of the year to recharge the wells. We have very deep wells. And so we test the source water and then we test after treatment. So we have treatment on Chestnut, and Swimming River obviously has treatment. And then for lead and copper, which is the topic that we're talking about today, lead in particular, you test at the tap. And so you're doing the first draw in the morning when you're testing. And this is important because some of this information that you get in your source water report, there's a chart that comes in it, and I'm going to show you. This is just a little easier to see, and then I'm going to show you the 2016 Red Bank chart that's in its consumer confidence report. I'm just going to point out a couple of things. There are more charts in the report, but I just picked out the part that has lead, right? So one thing to know is that when you test for lead in water supplies, there's a certain kind of protocol, and there's not a standard. There's an action level, and there's a difference. So the maximum contaminant levels are the standard. You sort of can't exceed that, otherwise you go into a violation. Maximum contaminant level goal is sort of your health goal. You're not legally required to meet it, but it's where you want to be. So you see on lead, the goal is to get to 0, right? Because as was stated before, there's no safe level of lead, so the goal is to get to 0. But the action level for lead is 15, okay? And the reason why it's called an action level is because you have to do a number of samples throughout the town, and every town has sort of different protocols to do depending on their size. They have to take a certain number of samples, and if let me explain it this way. If you have 100 samples, and you start from the lowest level at your first sample, and you get down to your 90th sample, the 90th percentile, and if that number is less than 15, then you're good in the terms of the law. Does everybody follow me? Okay. So if you exceed that 15, then you have to take certain kinds of steps. So you might do anti-corrosion, you might do lead line replacement, you might do a few different things, okay? So in this particular example, this is not Red Bank, The 90th percentile is 3, the action level is 15, so probably a pretty good system, right? You have a pretty low level here, okay? It says it's in compliance, and it's telling you that the typical source of it is the pipes, okay? So this just explains if 10% or more is higher than the 15, and again, this is explaining the goal versus, the goal for lead is 0. So what are we doing? I don't know which you're, because you could go fluid depending on which direction you're going. So this is the 2016 Red Bank. I couldn't find the 2017 online. It should actually be online. And normally you get it around July of each year. Yeah, so it's not online, so you might want to check that. So here, I'm just going to go down with lead, okay? Just, these are other things, and we're not talking about all these other things today. So I'm going to skip that. So again, remember, the action level's 15. In 2016, the 90th percentile was 12. That's maybe a little cause for concern, right? You're not actually beyond, but you don't know how close, how many, when they tested, we're at 12, right? Remember, the goal is to be at 0. So that other one I showed you was at 3, not too bad, but this is 12. So maybe something to look at. I'll leave that to you. Okay? So I don't know what the 2017 number is. But when I looked at New Jersey American, because New Jersey American is sort of the other half of the year of their numbers, and their number was, I don't want to say the wrong number. Their number was, it's a bigger system, right? It's coming from a different source. Their number in 2017 was 3. So what they do, like Red Bank does, it picks a certain number of samples. It goes to, I don't know if you do it randomly or I don't know how you select. Some towns they get volunteers, sometimes they randomly go and ask.
I can speak.
You could answer that question. Yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, so we were talking about the Safe Water Drinking Act and how important that was. A portion of that was lead thing in the 1970s when it came out. But in 1992, the DEP really got serious about their lead and copper contamination. And the reason for that, as Roy said very well, is that when you have heart disease, when you have high cholesterol, when you have high blood pressure, you can take a pill and help manage that. Lead and copper poisoning, you can't do anything about.
Right.
It's there. Copper you can do a little chelation, but lead poisoning you can't do anything about. It does its damage immediately. It is a very, very scary thing. And the most important thing I think people need to do is look at the sources of lead poisoning and make sure that you are trying to limit your exposure to those things. So drinking water is the easiest one for us to actually take a look at and do. But as Roy said before, lead paint in a house, if your house was built before 1978, there's a very big possibility, and I think most of Red Bank was built before 1978, there's a possibility that there's lead paint underneath of all that latex. Lead dust is the other way. You need to wipe down your windowsills on a regular basis. If you don't know if those windowsills have lead paint in them, you still need to wipe them down all the time. Just in case, even as an adult, even if you don't have any babies around. The reason that children are more susceptible to it, their bodies uptake the lead a little bit faster. And one more thing I want to make sure is mentioned in this. If you are a woman and you are going to have a child ever, lead accumulates in your body, it is passed through the placenta, and that is scary. So lead poisoning is not just a us issue, it is a generational issue, and it can be passed along to children. That being said, when Roy said that there was a perfect storm of just incompetence that happened in Flint, Michigan, and I think that probably is the right word. It was greed and incompetence that led to the situation there. In the state of New Jersey, thankfully, that is impossible to happen. Flint, Michigan made it even tougher because the state of New Jersey, now they have a lead team. And these people sit in a room, they talk to each other all day about ways to make sure water systems are more safe. And we have, as we go through my test results, and we can do that in a minute, you'll see that it's gotten more stringent over the last couple of years, which I welcome, absolutely welcome. So in the 92 law that changed lead, they made strict guidelines into the size of the system and how many samples you need to take. Red Bank is a system under 15,000, I believe it's 60 samples. And then what happens after you take your first 60 samples is once you prove that you're not exceeding action levels, normally you knock down to 30 samples, every 3 years, and you would do that. Now, the interesting thing is Red Bank, I've been here a couple years now, probably 5 or 6 years ago, they had a problem with their lead and copper sampling because they weren't following those 1992 guidelines. And it wasn't just Red Bank that had a problem, it was a lot of different communities. And I know in the town I was in 2004, they did an audit, we were the first year of audits, and they said, you guys deviated from your original sampling plan that you submitted in 1992. And my question was, what sampling plan was submitted in 1992? Which was actually what most water systems were saying at that time. So there were criteria. The EPA set up criteria to say, these are the houses you should be sampling. So any house, the prime locations are houses that were built between like 1974 and 1986. And don't hold me to those years, but I think that was it. And why? Because we know that's when houses use copper pipes almost exclusively interiorly and lead solder, 50-50 lead combination solder. So as Roy said, that a lot of houses in Red Bank do have solder, lead solder, I'm sure, 50-50 mix. If you have copper pipe, if your house was built before 1986, there's a possibility that your house actually has lead solder there. And there was a point where it was so expensive that people didn't use it, right? And then there was a point where it became cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and that was sometime in the early 70s. So almost universally, plumbers were using 50-50 solder. And if your house was built in 87, they might have had some in the truck still. So I would try to, count that.
That's true.
So in Red Bank, we have a little bit of an issue with our sampling sites in that those years, there aren't a whole lot of houses that fit the criteria. And the other thing with that is that a lot of single-family homes were turned into multi-family homes. And the DEP and the EPA are really specific about only using single-family homes for this type of testing. They don't want commercial businesses, you can't draw from hydrants, you can't draw from anything except single-family homes. And we've had some issues with following those guidelines historically over the years. So when I show you the number of samples that Red Bank has taken compared to the 30 that most other places have taken in 3 years, I think it was 212 over like a 5-year period. It's a lot of samples. So when we talk about lead and copper, I'm pretty confident that we are doing everything in our power. Now what you said is absolutely correct about the change in the water system. So we do use New Jersey American Water. It was part, when the Manasquan Reservoir was built, they started taking a really hard look at the aquifers and how much water was being drawn from the aquifers because they have a reservoir available. So there were limitations put on what we could pull out of the ground. So we do take 200 million gallons from New Jersey American that comes out of an aquifer, that comes out of the reservoir, excuse me. Water out of a water source is groundwater source, is a lot different than water out of a surface water source. So in surface water, you have to deal with a bunch of other issues. Algal blooms that change pH, Giardia, all kinds of issues. You don't have to deal with those things. So you treat water differently as well. And it's much easier for me as a surface groundwater producer to change my pH, to do the scaling, where the guys in surface water plants, sometimes there's alterations and changes in chemical that make it much harder. So our system is complex. I do have to say we're a T3 treatment system out of 4, and most of the time a groundwater system is only a T2. So our system is a little bit more complex than most, but it's nowhere near a surface water treatment plant. So after we're done with these reportings, what I'm going to do is actually show you guys how to look at any water system you want. And I want to say probably 10 years ago at least, the New Jersey DEP produced a website called New Jersey Safe Drinking Water Watch, and every community water system in the state is represented in that. And you can see every single one of their samples. You can see every single one of their violations. You can see every single exceedance, action levels, maximum contaminant levels, every single thing they've taken. because they made a rule that the reporting from the laboratories isn't done. They don't send me the results anymore. They send them right to the state. So the state knows almost at the same time that I do that there is a problem, which is a really good thing. And most of the time, luckily, the problems you see are with coliform tests. And that's only because there's so many coliform tests that are taken, you know, like 10, 20 a month, depending on your size, that there's a lot of human error involved. So lead and copper, the only human error is if you don't do the first draw correctly. So if your house is one of the 30 or 60 houses that we're drawing, and you're given a bottle and they say, please, these are the directions, follow those directions. Because if you just walk in your house and you fill it with water after you just used the tap, that's not gonna come up with lead or copper, right? The first draw sample means that the water has to be sitting between 6 and 12 hours. If it's been sitting longer than 12, it could spike the results in a way that you'll never use it. So that being said, the other thing that I wanna make sure I say is that if you have any questions, if there are any doubts in your mind, the test is very inexpensive for a lead and copper first draw sample. It's like $20 or $30. It is worth doing. And the way to ensure that you are not drinking lead or copper while you're drinking tap water is to just let the water run for a very short amount of time. Most of the interior pipes in your house, if you run the water for about 45 seconds to a minute, maybe even less because they probably used half-inch pipe in your house instead of 1-inch pipe, you will have clean water that's from the main. So you can alleviate a lot of those things. And I highly recommend that anytime you use a water fountain, anywhere on Earth, that the first thing you should do is let that thing run for a little bit. Water fountains have pipes inside of them that are mostly copper, mostly little tiny 1/4-inch copper pipes. If you just let that run for 10, 15 seconds, that water is going to be way cleaner than it would be otherwise. So I don't know what question I was supposed to ask. I hope I answered it.
It's okay.
All right, and
You're good.
I will talk more.
Okay, and you will talk more. So what are we doing here? This one? Oh, that one, okay. So I think we covered this one before. You mentioned about pregnant women. I just want to make an emphasis that the lead, it goes into the bones. And then if a pregnant woman isn't doing good nutritional care, they're not taking either calcium in the food or they're not taking calcium supplements, then you could start leaching the lead into the placenta, into the fetus, as you said, so creating problems. We already talked about that. Okay, that one, got it. So this is just a graphic version of the narrative that he gave, so I'm not going to go through all of this, but there's a lot of discussion and a lot of work being done. We have behavioral problems and other kinds of problems going on in generations, and there's been some work done to show that people who are having behavioral problems and other attention problems, when you start testing them for lead, there sometimes is an elevated blood level because of that. And again, it's not reversible. It happens, it's done. So we were talking before about flushing the pipes. I think you've heard that ad nauseum. The other thing is in your faucet, there's a little screen. If you just unscrew the little, I don't know what you call it.
Aerator.
The aerator. There's a little screen. Just clean out the screen. That's a good thing to do. We talked about cold water already, and also we talked about filters. Clean Water Action doesn't endorse a particular filter, but we do have a one-pager front and a back that just talks about, what do different filters do, and what value they have, and it gives you also really, really, really important to, if you decide to go on a filter route for any particular reason, one, you have to think about what is the volume of water that you're using, whether it's for the whole house or for a particular faucet. You have to make a commitment to changing the filter. If you're not going to make a commitment to changing the filter, then don't buy a filter, because you're actually going to poison yourself. Because what happens is the filters load up, and then when they're full, then they just keep dumping. So if you're not going to be committed to changing a filter on the schedule that's prescribed per the volume that you're going to be using it for, then don't use a filter. And then one thing that I would say is, you mentioned distilling water. Distilled water actually isn't the appropriate thing to drink. You know, you could use it for your iron if you want, but you shouldn't, you know, you want minerals actually in your water, because water does have, in addition to water being, you know, water, it has minerals in it that are important to your body, the little tiny bits of it, but if you distill it all out, the good and the bad, then you're not getting those kinds of minerals. So distilled water isn't advisable for constant drinking. You're not going to die if you drink it once, but I wouldn't do it on a regular basis. Let's see what else I have here. Oh, I don't know why I have. Oh, so in terms of what you should do, I'm doing a lot of work right now in Newark. We're actually going door to door with door knockers and trying to get people to agree to replace their service lines because they have, well, they're up to 23,000 service lines that need to be replaced in Newark. So one option is to replace your service line, but it's not a cheap option. And in Red Bank, I don't think there's any subsidy mechanism. Newark has a subsidy that they're figuring out from their water utility, but the other is the utility side, as you spoke, does anti-corrosion control to reduce the leaching that happens. So there's different things you can do personally. So you can do the flushing of the water and all those things. You can replace this pipe that goes from the curb to your house, and the utility obviously does anti-corrosion. Altogether makes it better. So I just want to speak to this issue. Bottled water, is it safer? No, it's not necessarily safer, and it's 1,000 times more expensive. Why isn't it necessarily safer? Bottled water is just that, it's bottled. It literally could be tap water put in a bottle. And in some cases it is, even in the state of New Jersey, they just turn on the tap and they just put it in a bottle and then you pay for it. Also, municipal water actually is way cheaper. I know people complain about their water bill, but it's still way cheaper than buying bottled water. And also you don't have all the plastic. Water in plastic heats up and then you're drinking plastic. So not such a great idea, not such a great option. I know in some cases people need, they need, pretty, I don't want to say pristine, that's not what some people have medical conditions and they need water to be a certain quality. They're not necessarily going to get it from bottled water. In fact, sometimes we've done tests and done some joint reports with other organizations, and in some cases the water from bottles is worse than the water that's coming out of the tap. And also batch number 1 from company X may not be the same as batch number 2, so it's not consistent. Even though it might be Poland spring water, it's not, every bottle isn't the same, every batch isn't the same. So it's just something to keep in mind. And then, the EPA does regulate public water. The FDA sort of regulates bottled water. They're not as vigorous on bottled water, so you're not even getting your water tested to the same degree and as many contaminants. New Jersey tests for more contaminants than at the federal level. We're doing 94 contaminants. We just set a new standard for PFOAs, which is the Teflon that's prevalent in our water supply. So New Jersey actually has more standards and more protections and has gone farther than the federal government. So turn on your tap, protect your public water supply. That's what we should be doing. This is who I am, if you want to get a hold of me. So just a couple of things I want to point out again is, if you're interested in different types of filters, this will give you some information. And then I do have a brochure on lead in drinking water. Has some of these tips that we've all been talking about, but also there's information about here in lead in soil. A lot of people always talk about paint, but it's also in the soil, especially if your house is leaded on the outside, then it gets into the soil. And so we give tips to people about what they can do. If you're not going to remove all the soil, and you don't really have to remove all the soil, You could put bushes there, you know, so that kids and people aren't wandering in there. But also we give tips to people inside about composting and gardening. So if you have leaded soil, you could do raised beds, so you could bring in soil or compost, but you should make sure you test it, because sometimes what you bring in could be worse than what you already have, and that's happened before. But also, if you're gonna go on soil that you're concerned about, you might do a couple of things. One is, don't grow leafy vegetables because the lead goes into the leaves. But if you grow tomatoes, it's not going in the tomato. So you might think about different kinds of things that you decide to grow, or if you're concerned about, you want to grow lettuce and you have leaded soil, again, you could do raised beds, or you could get a container and put the lettuce in a container and grow it in the container instead and put it in clean soil. So doesn't mean that you don't have to garden if you want to garden, but just be, you know, mindful of, you know, how lead travels, you know, in plants, and then what your exposure could be. So if you're interested in any of that, you can take them out. They'll just be right over here on the side. All right?
Sounds good.
All right, so I'm going to leave the rest to you.
All right. I have